Hello! I think I'm supposed to say AP World Historian. Supposedly everybody said I need to have some sort of like catchphrase like Heimler or something, but I'm not. I'm probably not that famous. I'm definitely not that famous.
Yeah.
So here's the deal. I am mask off at the moment because I have two lovely individuals here who are hanging out with me this afternoon while we do this to help ask a few questions, but they are very distant in the back, and I want to make sure that people can see my face a little bit as we're doing this, just to probably help you out a little bit to understand what I'm saying. So what we are doing today, we are looking at a regional approach. We're going to try to do these each afternoon. Today's regional approach is about East Asia. I love that I have my thing up here for you to see. This I got in Japan actually a long time ago, so that kind of makes it nice as well. But we have a screen up here in the back that I've written a few things up on. I'll make sure that you can see those as we go through that stuff. I may need to pivot a little bit as we go through. But hopefully you can see that stuff okay. So first thing we need to do probably is talk about what is East Asia, right? So when the College Board talks about various places, they have a very specific meaning for those places. So they are going to mean things like when they talk about South Asia, they mean India. When they talk about East Africa, they're talking about Swahili city-states and all that stuff, right? So for East Asia, we're primarily talking about these three countries up here. So we're talking about these modern countries, like China, Japan, and Korea. Those are our three big ones. You could also think of Taiwan, though whether that's independent or not is a huge debate. But that would also be included in this as well. You could maybe include like Mongolia or something like, modern day Mongolia, though I don't think they'll have questions about any modern day Mongolian stuff. But that is primarily it. Make sure that we understand that this is not Vietnam. This is not anywhere in Southeast Asia. It's not Thailand or anything like that. It's going to be these three things. When we talk about the College Board and their different units, each of those units is sort of organized into a time period as well. And we've talked about these a little bit in class over time, but basically we have 1200 to about 1450 is our first time period. This will be units 1 and 2, I think. Yeah, 1 and 2. Okay, then we have 1450 to 1750. This is going to include units like 3, 4, 5, I believe. Then 1750 to 1900. And then lastly, 1900 to the present. That is going to be our units 8 and 9 down there at the bottom. Well, I guess 7, 8, and 9 probably. Yeah, 7, 8, 9 because it includes World War I and World War II. So those are our sort of time periods. So what we're looking at here then is trying to place some of these kingdoms and some of this history and stuff within these certain time periods. While we talk about them, and hopefully that'll make some sense to it. Okay, so let's start over in China. Does that sound good? All right, sounds great. So we're talking about China, the initial Chinese dynasty. This is very political, by the way. These are political areas, and we'll talk about the individuals here and like some of the other things about them in just a second. But if we want to try to establish like a political structure to our conversation about East Asia, let's start there. So for China, we have the Southern Song, or just the Song dynasty. They will be around in 1200 when we start this time period, and they'll be there at about 1279. You'll notice it's the Southern Song. The Song actually are initially quite large, but then they get invaded by the Jin, and so they get pushed south, and so we have this period known as the Southern Song. This is before our time period. I can't imagine that you would necessarily need to know that. It could be good for context, I guess, but it's just not something you're probably going to have to know. Then in about 1270s or so, we're going to have the Yuan Invasion. So again, you'll notice the Song go until 1279, but the Yuan are going to start in 1271. That's because the Song will not be completely snuffed out until 1279. Yuan Dynasty is also, of course, the Mongol Dynasty. So this is going to be the Mongols invading, so Genghis Khan and all of his ilk. And the Yuan Dynasty will be in charge of China until about 1368, when the Ming will rise up. Okay, so you'll notice again, this is a little bit before this, so the Ming actually are going to bleed over a little bit, but I went ahead and put them into the second time period here for us. So after the Yuan, then we will have the Ming, and one of the things I always like to think about is the Ming are like the antithesis of the previous group. They are the antithesis of the Mongols. So when you think of the Mongols, you think about these like giant armies, and they're incorporating various things into it. Like, this sounds kind of bad, but traditional images of the Mongols are like this ravening horde, that's taking all they can and incorporating it into themselves. So they also are kind of cosmopolitan. Like, they're more than happy to go in places and, oh, these are cool. Oh, I like this wall that you built, or I like this new technology and stuff. So the Yuan or the Mongols are more than willing to take in all these new ideas and new things. The Ming, on the other hand, are the opposite of that. They are like the core idea of China, right? Like they want to be China more than anybody has ever China'd before, right? So they want to go all the way back to the original stuff, Confucianism, Neo-Confucianism, big things for them. They don't want outside stuff. They don't want to be different. They don't want to be like things that are outside of them. They just want to be China. They are willing to trade, but they don't want stuff into their country instead. They're more than happy just sort of being China. We'll get into more details about them in a minute. So what happens then? Oh, and by the way, the Yuan were overthrown by a peasant rebellion, which is where the Ming are going to come in. This happens a lot in Chinese history, with a few exceptions. You will see a lot of times peasant rebellions will lead to the overthrow. So in 1644, then we will have an invasion of the Ming. They are sort of weak militarily, and they get invaded by a group called the Manchus, who come from Manchuria. And so the Manchus then will establish the Qing Dynasty in 1644. And that dynasty will last until 1911. So it will actually extend itself through the 1750 and the 1900 period here, down into the modern period with 1900 to the present, which is our last little section here. So let me pan this down just a smidge. So again, we will have then in 1911, we will have the overthrow of the Qing at long last. And we will have a group called the Nationalists. Now, I have the numbers 1911 to 1949, but again, the Nationalists are kind of iffy on all this. Like, they don't really have control of the country perfectly the whole time. They have the majority control, but they definitely are not fully in control of this area. And so in World War II, they will help to fend off the Japanese. But after the war is over, then their war with the communists will restart. And so in 1949, they will lose and they will flee to Taiwan. I guess you could technically say they don't end in 49 because there is still Taiwan, but of course that's a different country basically. And then lastly, we will have the communists from 1949 until question mark ... The present is what we're talking about. Okay, so this is our sort of history of China. We'll come back to some more details on this in just a second. Let's look at a contemporaneous look, though, here at Japan. Now, this is a lot more detailed than we went over this year. It is probably a lot more detailed than you need. Same thing also kind of true here for Korea as well. So just understand if you're kind of like, wow, I don't know this stuff, or this seems a bit much. Like, that's the thing here. I'm putting a little bit of extra material in here just so we kind of have a little bit of context or understanding. But we definitely talked about a number of these things over the year, particularly like the Meiji Restoration and more modern stuff. So what we're looking at here in around 1200 then, we are going to have the beginnings of the shogunate kind of idea, okay? So remember that Japan has an emperor who is supposed to be in charge of the country, but is not actually in charge of the country. That person doesn't do anything. They are basically a figurehead. According to Japanese folklore, the emperor and the imperial family is descended from Amaterasu, who is the sun goddess. And so they are like literally holy and divine. So, why would you want your divine god or goddess to get their hands dirty with politics and stuff? So what happens then is that a number of powerful families over the years will take over and be in charge. So the Kamakura initially, 1185 to 1336, this is kind of the beginning of what we might consider a shogunate today, where you have like a powerful figure or family or whatever, or a military leader who's in charge. Right after that, then, we will have the Muramachi, which is under the Ashikaga family. So this is the Ashikaga shogunate. And this is kind of our beginning time period here. During the Kamakura, by the way, the Mongols will invade or attempt to invade, and they are forced out. So that's kind of our little link here. Now, fast forward a little bit to the 1450s or so. This whole period of the Ashikaga gets weirder and weirder, like there's less and less control. And finally, an open civil war will break out known as the Sengoku Period or the Sengoku Jidai. This is like, if you've ever seen any like samurai movies or that kind of stuff, they're almost always set during this time period. It's like a kind of like the Wild West is for American movies. Like, people love to watch movies and stuff all about this. And this period lasts for quite a long time. I mean, it's over 100 years that this country is divided up into these things. It is not constant. It's not like every day everybody's fighting a battle or anything. But basically, the country is divided up into these little like families and little groups that are going to be a big problem. So around 1600, then, we're going to have this battle called the Battle of Sekigahara. And that will lead to the creation of the Edo or Tokugawa shogunate, okay, the Edo period or the Tokugawa shogunate. Now, there's a couple of other guys in here, like Oda Nobunaga, as well as Hideyoshi Toyotomi, who are going to sort of establish or lead the way for Tokugawa. But this battle that he fights and then his ability to consolidate control then means he is going to be the one who is in charge. And from 1603 until 1867, the Tokugawa family will be in charge of this country. So fast forward then a little bit, we go to the Meiji in 1867 until about 1912. So Meiji is the name of the emperor, and this is that big reform that we see, where they're going to go from this like sort of feudal, shogunate system. And initially, the idea is that the emperor is going to do stuff, but again, the emperor doesn't end up doing anything. Instead, it's a group of oligarchs, like powerful, wealthy people that are going to end up being in charge of this instead. But it is a change of pace. It's from the old sort of feudal military system into a new system whereby they were trying to become much more modern. So one of the things that they'll do is they will sort of go around the world and adopt new ideas and new concepts and things from around the world and kind of make their world a whole lot different. So, for example, if we've ever watched any anime or read any manga or whatever, we know that like all the little kids wear like little sailor suits and stuff like that. That is because they adopt the Prussian military system, which encouraged naval outfits for some reason. So that's where they get that initially from, is from that location or region. I remember when I visited Japan, all the little kids like came down to go to school one day, and when I was staying in a homestay, and they all had these ridiculous little sailor costumes on, and I was like, I can't believe this is real. This is amazing. So it was pretty funny. Following on, then we're going to get into our 1900 to present, and of course, the big thing that's going on here in history is going to be Japanese militarization and eventually World War II. So we're going to have the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, where the Russians will be defeated by the Japanese, which is a big upset. I mean, this is like, if UAB beat Alabama in college football or something, right? Huge upset because the Japanese were really kind of written off. People didn't think they were that important whatsoever. So in 1905, then we will end up having what's called the Showa Period. This is going to be the new emperor, Hirohito. He will be the emperor until the end of, until actually much later. I forget exactly when he dies, but it's after World War II. So this is going to be, though, our period of what we might call Japanese militarism. So from about 1926 until the defeat in World War II in 1945, Japan will be under a militaristic government. It gets a lot worse in like 31, so it's kind of like initially just the military is powerful, but about 31 and on, we're going to see the military gain more and more power, much like we see in places like Germany and stuff, that they will get a lot of power. 1945, then, of course, after World War II, the United States will help to rebuild Japan, and we will rebuild them into this modern, prosperous country that it is today, which is the present modern-day country of Japan up until today. Okay? Again, stop me anytime if you have some questions here.
Yes, and that's why Japan and America have such good relations.
Yes, the question was, the comment was, that's why they have such good relations. Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, we don't really give them too much of an option, right, after World War II, but General Douglas MacArthur, who eventually goes on to the Korean War, will be the guy who's put in charge. His title is like literally like Supreme Ruler of Japan. Like, it's a crazy title. And he basically has like full authority under the military to just do whatever he wants. And so he functionally just gives them their constitution. Like, he definitely consults with people, but then just like, here, this is it. And it really remakes Japan in a huge way. And, even outside of the effect of like politicians remaking Japan, there's a lot of cultural things. So like, baseball is popular in America and Canada and like some Latin American countries and Japan, right? And the reason is that American GIs, when they were there, would play baseball, and the Japanese people would see them and they got interested in it, and so forth and so on. Here's a crazy connection as well. So we know that a lot of our video game companies and video games come from Japan, right? One of the reasons for that is that in the wake of when all the American soldiers are there over in Japan, they're looking for something to do. They don't really have a lot to do. So Americans import these electromechanical machines. These are like, what do you call this thing? Skee ball tables and stuff. So they import things like that, these old kind of like carnival games. And when the Japanese saw these carnival game kind of things, they thought these are cool. And so a lot of our modern day companies like Sega, I think is one of these, like a couple of these Japanese video game companies started making these electromechanical machines for the military or for local consumption, and then built it out from there. So bizarrely, we are, in some small sense, the United States is sort of the founder of the Japanese game industry in a way because of that. So kind of weird, right? Some of those companies, not so much. Like Nintendo, for example, made like baseball cards, or not, like they made playing cards and stuff before that. But they definitely also got into to some of this as well. But yeah, that's why one of the major reasons why our relations are pretty good with the Japanese today. But oftentimes fraught, they can have problems as well. Okay, let's take a look at Korea. Again, Korea is not huge on the College Board curriculum. They will show up on occasion. You might see them in like a document or something as sort of like evidence of something else. So, if you're trying to focus your time in on what to study, the history of Korea, probably not the number one thing you need to worry about too much. But they do tie in well with a lot of the other stuff that's going on here. So Mongol invasion of Korea in 1231. So the Mongols will come in and conquer Korea. They don't have the advantage of the ocean like the Japanese do, nor do they have the famous kamikaze wave that destroyed the Mongol invasion. Here they actually get invaded, and so they will become tribute states of the Yuan Dynasty and those dynasties. So they will essentially be under the authority. And this is kind of the way that Korea is going to be up until fairly recently. Like Korea is a strong country, but it is also not as big as its neighbors like China and places. And so what we'll have basically is a series of these Korean kingdoms. There's a couple different names, Joseon and Goyeon and all this stuff, but it doesn't matter as much for us. But you'll have a series of these Korean kingdoms, and they will essentially be under China with some form of tribute. So from about 1450 on, they have this tribute system that they are going to use to pay into the Chinese. It's kind of funny sometimes. Like people will come to them and be like, "Hey, can we trade?" And they'll be like, "Oh, sorry, we're under the Chinese for tribute. You'll have to go talk to them." And then they go to the Chinese, and Chinese are like, "We don't care. They just give us money. You can do whatever." So they'll sort of run people around because they don't want to do the trade that the people want to do. So fast forward then through this time period. Again, there are a series of sort of other important events. Like culturally, the Koreans will create like their language, their writing system called Hangul, and a couple of other things like that as well. But the real important kind of world historical thing here then is going to be around the 1900s. So around the 1900s then, the Koreans will be invaded and colonized by Japan. So Japan is looking for expansion territory as a result of the Russo-Japanese War. They will use that as a pretext to sort of claim the Korean peninsula, and they will force it to be a colonial state under Japan. They are really bad to the Koreans in a lot of ways. They try to stamp out Korean culture, for example, by demanding that Koreans rename themselves Japanese names. They suppress like local foods and cultural items and stuff as well, and are pretty brutal to the Koreans in that period. Also, during the war itself, they are also pretty brutal towards the Koreans as a result of what are known as comfort women. This is where they forced a number of Korean women to engage in prostitution for the Japanese military. They will use their occupation of Korea to invade into Manchuria. So in 1931, and then later on in 1937, they will invade Manchuria from the Korean peninsula here. Then, of course, World War II takes place, 39 to 45. During that war, there won't be a ton of fighting necessarily there until the very end of it. But of course, in the end of the war, there will be a division of Korea between the North and the South, and that's going to be in 1945. And then that will essentially be the same situation that we are in today with a communist, really totalitarian. It's not even communist really, but totalitarian North and today a free democratic South that's an ally with the United States and Japan and other places like that. So that is sort of our establishment today. Okay, questions here? You look like you have a question.
Me?
Yeah.
Oh, no.
K-pop, right? Am I right? Is that it? No, I'm
Yeah.
just kidding. That's fine. That's fine. It's funny if you like know anything about the history of K-pop. Like most Korean music in the '80s was they were still under this like authoritarian dictator. So most of the music, like the popular music, was like this awful stuff, like praising the leaders and stuff, being like, we're South Korea, we're the best, our leaders are fantastic. Like that was like their pop music. That was like what they played on like pop stations. And so into all this then comes this band that establishes what we know as K-pop today. And so they were just like wildly popular. Like the moment they appeared on this TV show, people like the people who ran the TV show thought they would just be sort of like a little random thing nobody would care about, and they just blew up. And from then on, that system that we know of as K-pop today is in effect. So, all right, other questions? Any of this here before we go into a little more detail about some of these folks here, some of these things. So let's take a look at a little bit about China in general. One thing that the Global Tapestry Unit 1 does for us is that it tries to establish a couple things about the Song Dynasty that indicate the Song Dynasty as the beginnings, in a sense, of Chinese culture. So they talk a lot about like Chinese cultural stuff that had existed prior to this. So for example, Confucianism, Buddhism, that kind of stuff, right? But don't forget, the Song don't like invent it. This is the problem with the new curriculum, is that it starts in 1200. So it sort of sounds like they pin everything on the Song Dynasty as though they were the ones who created all these things, but they're just basically the inheritors of a lot of this stuff. Okay, so a couple of things politically, we are going to have things under the Song Dynasty like a bureaucracy, which is designed to run the government. That's the people who are going to run things and keep things together. There is a bit of a meritocracy within this government also. That's based on those civil service exams. So if you're able to do well in the civil service exams, you can have a good job. You can work in the government under that bureaucracy. Again, certain people have more resources. So like if you're from a wealthy family or a high-level family, you can invest money to try to fix that instead, so you can end up having better education for it. But at least theoretically, you could have a little bit of meritocracy for that. Some agricultural and other kinds of innovations and things. One thing we're going to have is the Grand Canal. So if you don't remember this, basically there's two major rivers in China. I'm not going to butcher their names, but one of them is in the north, one of them is further down to the south. And so what happens then is before the Song Dynasty, they create this canal that goes between the two rivers, right? This would sort of be like if you made a canal between, dang, we only really have one big river, don't we? Like Mississippi. If you made like a canal across like Illinois to link the Mississippi and the Ohio River or something, that would make no sense because they meet up anyway. But you know what I mean? Like you're basically taking two rivers and you're building a canal between them so that you can move things between stuff on that canal. That's what they did. Now remember, this is way before any technologies or whatever that we have today. Like this is just like a lot of hard labor, but the ability to create that canal then increases a lot of trade and stuff up and down that river. So they are going to be one of the groups who is helping to maintain that and make it even bigger. Champa rice, which apparently is the hotness this year. I know, like everybody, this is like the hotness this year. It seems like every year people get obsessed with stuff. When I was watching the Heimler videos that they were doing, the reviews they were doing online, the live reviews the past couple nights, everybody just kept typing Champa rice into the chat the whole time. So whatever. But yeah, Champa rice, again, the importance of that then is that it's going to lead to a massive increase in population, which will continue on through this period. So it makes it a little bit better. Also, gunpowder and guns, steel, compass, steel and a compass, paper, woodblock printing. These are all other innovations that they're creating at the time. For external trade kind of stuff, again, Silk Roads are going to be in effect in this period. They're trading porcelain, textiles, teas, things like that all around the world. They're taking tribute from these Koreans over here to get money back to them as well. Those are all things that are happening in that period. Culturally, we have Confucianism, Buddhism, and Neo-Confucianism. So do we want to go over that any at all? A little more about Confucianism, Buddhism? Yeah. Yeah, sure. So this is always difficult for me because I swear to you, I've taught this class 10 years. And I've studied things before that for history, but I still, to this day, like, I find it difficult to try to explain to people the difference in Confucianism and Neo-Confucianism, okay? So, but here's the primary thing about it, right? It's more important to understand, like, what caused it than it is to understand exactly what it is. What happens is that Confucianism is a system that is largely political and social, right? And it really emphasizes staying in your place. So if you're a peasant, you need to stay where you are and be a good peasant. That's what Confucianism is all about, right? If you are the king, you need to be the best king that you can be. So the problem, though, is that when things like Buddhism come in, or even Christianity come in, and people are like, oh, no, you can have a better life in the future, or, oh, we can help you with your daily problems if you say a prayer, right? Like that can help things out. Well, Confucianism doesn't really have much of an answer to that. Like Confucianism definitely embraces gods and goddesses and things, but it's not really like built into the system, really, right? So the problem for a lot of the Confucians was that they were sort of like losing followers or losing believers to the ideas of Buddhism and some of these other things. So Neo-Confucianism is essentially a modification of traditional Confucian beliefs that is designed to sort of like recapture a little bit of that, right? Like it's like Confucianism 2.0, new and special, right? And the idea then is that they will embrace some of the like kind of metaphysical kind of aspects of it. They'll talk a little more about gods and goddesses and stuff, but otherwise it's not necessarily too different from what you would traditionally see. Does that make any sense? I mean, yeah, again, it's difficult to try to explain exactly what it is. What we do see, though, is some things like it really buckles down on a few traditional ideas, such as like you see in Neo-Confucianism, there's a higher emphasis on like patriarchy and stuff. That's not uncommon to see in that period also. Yeah, so this is also when we're going to start to see foot binding, which will continue on through the Ming Dynasty and others. It gets real big in the Ming because, again, the Ming want to be more Chinese than anybody who's ever been Chinese. So when they go back to the Song to look for inspiration, they are pulling forward all these things like foot binding and stuff, and so they will do that stuff even more than had been done otherwise. All right. Yeah, who's got questions about the Song Dynasty then before we move on? So let's talk a little bit about the Yuan Dynasty or the Mongol Dynasty. We're not going to go into too much detail because the Mongols are so much bigger in a lot of ways than just this time period, though if we have some Mongol questions, I'm more than happy to answer those. But again, the Mongol Dynasty, the Mongols will come in and invade into China here in 1271 and take over. Kublai Khan will be sort of like the first of these big big emperors of the dynasty. They will reestablish it and they will invade all the way down into essentially like Vietnam and stuff, and they will establish it. So one of the things that Yuan does is that they are very cosmopolitan, right? They really want to incorporate other ideas. This is something that the Mongols love to do as well. So they, if they can make money off stuff, they're perfectly happy to do new things. They don't want to do new things if it's not going to help them, but if it's going to help them out, they have absolutely no problem whatsoever with doing that. So this China is going to be the sort of biggest part of the Mongol Empire, but of course there are other parts of it as well. Generally speaking, the Chinese really hate being under the Mongols. They are foreigners. They are not similar to them. Kublai Khan was pretty Sinicized, meaning he really liked a lot of things about Chinese culture. He married some Chinese wives, but he is not as interested in all the details of it. And he and the other following Mongol leaders are just really perceived to be foreigners, and so that makes people really unhappy about it. As the Mongol kings get more and more distant and away, we will start to see more and more peasants and other groups kind of rising up and being unhappy with the Mongols. Now, during this time period, though, again, they will be very heavy on the trade that's going on. So trade routes like the Silk Road are going to be super important during this period. They are going to help to protect the Silk Road. The Yuan Dynasty is the end of the Silk Road, essentially. Places like Chang'an and all that are going to be at the very end of it, but they will still benefit from all the trade and stuff that is going on. When we get into the Ming, then, the Ming are going to be founded by a peasant rebellion. Fascinatingly enough, the first emperor of the Ming is going to literally be a peasant. He rises up and is able to seize control of the peasant rebellion, and he is able to defeat the Mongols and establish himself as the brand new emperor of the Ming. The most important things for me for the Ming Dynasty is just simply that they want to go back in time, really, right? They really want to change everything as it used to be, make it basically like it used to be back in the good old days. Let me see. Yeah, this is all kind of split up a little bit. Yeah, so they're going to essentially kind of do things like ban foreign trade. They're going to reconstruct the Great Wall. They are going to emphasize Confucianism. They will return to things like the civil service exam, which had not been there. They had sort of cut out the civil service exam, so they're going to rebuild the civil service exam under their authority. This is also one important thing about the Ming is Zhonghe, who is the famous eunuch, the Muslim eunuch, who will take the voyages and take the trips. He is going to be a good example of the exception to the rule of the Ming. The Ming are generally do not go out and do stuff, but his patron, the Emperor Yongle, is going to want him to go do these things. He's like, yes, I want you to go try these things out. So I believe it's 4 voyages. I could be wrong in the exact number, but I'm pretty sure it's 4 voyages that he takes where he goes to India, and he goes all the way to Africa on one of them, and he investigates, he takes tribute and trade and all this kind of stuff. But when he finally gets back, eventually his patron dies, and he is unable to continue these, and they sort of shut it all down. So it's kind of an example of the exception that proves the rule about the Ming, which is that they don't want to deal with people who are outside of that area. Okay, so that's going to go up to the Ming. Questions about the Ming or anything we went before? Yeah.
How do you spell that guy's name?
Which one?
Traveler.
Zhonghe. It looks like Zheng He is what it looks like. In fact, you often hear it just pronounced this way. And again, I'm not saying my pronunciation is excellent. So Zheng, Z-H-E-N-G, and then H-E. Looks like Zheng He. Yeah, I don't speak Chinese. It's very tonal, so it's difficult to pronounce sometimes. I will say that I was watching a TV show, and well, I'll be honest, I'm a nerd. It was Star Trek. And one of the ships that came in was called the Zheng. They called it the Zheng He, and I was like, it hurts, but okay. Close enough, I guess. So anyway, so that is the time period for that. Next up then, we are going to get to our Qing Dynasty, and of course, this is the one where the Europeans start to come in and cause problems. They had previously caused problems for the Ming, so for example, the Jesuits had tried to go and convert the Ming Dynasty into a Christian group, but they did not. They were unable to do that, and they had a lot of trade. They're going to have this McCartney mission that will go to try to open up trade with them, but they will be basically rejected. So the Ming are essentially rejecting foreign trade, and that is what's going to lead the Europeans. There's a lot that will lead the Europeans to dominate them. Partly just because they want to dominate these things, but part of it also is this rejection of trade. So what happens then is that the Europeans will come in and they will start trading with the Qing once they take over under the Manchu. So for both of these groups, when they're trading, they're just not really, the Chinese are not buying anything from the Europeans. The Europeans are buying tea, fine porcelain, all this kind of great stuff, right? But they're not getting anything back. Okay, they're not like the Chinese are barely buying any European goods, which means that there's a very negative trade balance. If we remember in this period, we're talking about things like mercantilism, which is the idea that there's only like one group of like money in the world, and that like if we're giving it out, we're not getting anything back or whatever. So the countries like Britain and stuff are just super mad about this because they want to trade back and forth to get money from both groups. So the solution to this then, famously, of course, is to sell them what? Drugs, right. So around this period that they start doing this, which is going to be in about 1800 or so, so it's in sort of, we're kind of down in this period now, the British have established the British East India Company, and they also had pretty widespread control in India. And in India, what grows in the sub-Saharan continent is a whole lot of poppies. So they are able to process this opium, and they start selling it to the Qing. Qing, of course, get upset about this, and they say, don't do that anymore, and that launches two wars called the Opium Wars, where the British are trying to enforce their rules. That will only weaken the Qing even more. Now, according to the mandate of heaven, what should have happened when the Qing are getting weaker and weaker in the 1850s or so, what should we probably have had happen instead? There should be a what? Yeah, exactly. New ruler. Everything should be reestablished and changed over. But that doesn't happen because the Europeans are essentially propping up the Qing dynasty to make sure that it stays nice and weak so that they can continue to exploit it. So we'll end up having these like zones of control kind of things called, what are they called? They are called spheres of influence that they're able to trade within. The different European powers almost like kind of carved them up. They will eventually see a whole bunch of other turmoil. So the Taiping Rebellion will be in this period. That's when that crazy religious guy comes out and tries to declares the Qing or the Manchu as like literal devils and that we should fight against them. It causes a lot of death and destruction. That will cause more and more Chinese to move to America, which is why we have our wonderful Chinese culture here in America over time. And that will be a big difference and a big change. Now, ultimately, though, the Qing will get weaker and weaker and weaker over this time, and that will eventually lead to the overthrow of the Qing in 1911 by basically a group of warlords. Like, we can talk about the Nationalists and say, like, oh, they're like the George Washington of China or whatever, but not really. I mean, these are a bunch of people who are like basically like governors of large provinces that have like built themselves little armies, right? And so guys like Sun Yat-sen, who is sort of one of the founders of this nationalist movement, are trying to get them all to agree and like create a national army and like reform, the government, but they don't necessarily want that. But what they do want to do is to get rid of the old Qing. So in 1911, they depose the last emperor, and then they have this sort of nationalist government, which is just chaos. Like, it's just corruption and chaos. They're finally, under Chiang Kai-shek, able to get it together a little bit. Like, they're able to reform it just enough so that it's working okay, and they're able to rule the country ineffectively, but at least rule it. So the communists at this time period are actually allies with the nationalists. They are part of the nationalist big umbrella that we have there, and as part of that big umbrella, they are working together, but they realize that the communists are basically being paid off by the Soviet Union. They aren't happy with them. They are worried that they're going to rise up and take out the nationalists. So the nationalists force them out. That causes this thing called the Long March, where the communists march from South China all the way up to North China. A very foundational moment. Y'all on the news this weekend, did y'all see how the spaceship basically fell out of the sky from the Chinese? Did you see anything about this? So basically, over the weekend, there was this some piece of space debris that the Chinese had sent up into space. It accidentally got stuck in orbit, and they had no idea when it was going to come down or where it was going to come down. They finally figured out when it was going to come down, but they didn't know where. Like, it could have like hit like Alabama or somewhere. Like, we had no. I know, yeah, it would have been pretty bad. It ultimately ended up hitting in the Indian Ocean near the Maldives. So it was okay, but pretty nuts. Anyway, that missile was called the Long March. Like, that's how important the Long March is to their mythology. They named their space rockets after it. Anyway, so 1949 then, so they will resume. They will have World War II, and then they will resume their conflict after World War II. And in 1949, the communists will get the upper hand, and they will force the nationalists out to Taiwan. From then on, then we have our communists, and we'll mainly have kind of two things to think about here. Primarily the initial phase, which is going to be under Mao Zedong. He will be the communist leader who is going to run the country in its early days. He is going to be the guy who's responsible for the Great Leap Forward that is unsuccessful, which then leads to the Cultural Revolution, where like people are being killed and stuff as a result of this sort of crazy communist authority. In 1976, then, he will die. And then we will have Deng Xiaoping, who will be the new guy who comes in, who starts all these market reforms to try to like reform China and turn it into a slightly better thing. And so that is what we are in a situation today. So China today is basically run by the Chinese Communist Party, which is essentially like a dictatorship. But it has a lot of market-based kind of things like companies and stuff that are running in that country. Even though it's technically a communist country, it has a lot of these businesses that are doing things there. Okay, there's a little short discussion of some of the major points here of Chinese history. Who's got any questions about that?
Okay, this isn't about Chinese history.
Not a problem.
Wasn't he the guy that, Deng Xiaoping, wasn't he the guy that swam on the river?
That did what? No, that's Mao Zedong.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so if you remember from the video we watched, like Mao Zedong is the guy, they're asking about, Deng Xiaoping, Mao Zedong. So Deng Xiaoping is the guy who famously early on in his rule, he swam in the river to show how strong he was because he's a very strong swimmer. And then as he is like faced with irrelevance because of his failure in the Great Leap Forward, he decides to get back in the river again and do the swim or whatever to show how he's still young and healthy. And so a lot of people consider that to be sort of the launch of the Cultural Revolution. Like when he does that and then starts giving some speeches about this great proletariat cultural revolution, that's considered to be the beginnings of this whole process. Deng Xiaoping is actually the opposite of that. He is not. He was in the party itself, so he has a fascinating story too. He was in the party and he was like allied with Mao Zedong, and then just fell out of favor. I'm not 100% sure what that is. There's a lot of politics there. I'm sure I don't understand, but for whatever reason, he falls out of favor, and so Mao makes him go work at a tractor factory, like for years, for like 10 years. Like this would be like if like all of a sudden, Biden's like, hey, Pelosi, you got to go work in a tractor factory or something for 10 years. Like this guy was essentially like almost the vice president. He was like super high up in the Chinese government, and he just had a falling out with Mao, so he makes him go to the tractor factory for 10 years. I feel like that should be like a metaphor for something. You got to go to the tractor factory. So that's one of the downsides to being in that thing is like if you went against Mao's personality cult, you could end up being in a pretty bad situation if he doesn't like you very much. So, all right. Cool. Let's do a little bit more detail here on the Japanese. I don't think that we need too much more of this. And then, again, same thing with Korea as well. So the primary thing you need to understand about these places is one of the things they like to ask about is like similarities and differences between them a lot. Like how is Japan and China sort of similar or different? And they have a couple of different versions of this. Like, for example, if we talk about China as sort of our standard or whatever, how do these other groups, which is not necessarily fair to the Japanese, the Koreans, but if we were to say that, how would they be different? Well, one thing is that Japan will have a lot stronger influence for Buddhism, as will Korea. So Buddhism very strong in China, but in those two countries it's particularly strong, particularly in Korea. And so as a result of that then, some of the other things like Confucianism, while they are being held by those groups, are not the most important thing. So like Japan, for example, definitely incorporates Confucianism in some of its government, but Buddhism and stuff like that is also extremely important to them. You're also going to see differences too with like political systems. So China has a functioning imperial government, right? Japan does not have a functioning imperial government. It has this weird, military system or whatever. And Korea has a kingdom, though it's basically the same. It's like one ruler who has a fair amount of authority. The difference, though, in Korea is that it's very aristocratic. Okay, like in China, they don't have a lot of aristocrats. Japan, they have like full-on aristocrats, basically, if you think of like the different families. But in Korea, while they have a king who is functional, they also have a lot of these aristocrats that are going to be there and functional as well. So as we go through this, then again, we are going to have this unusual bakufu style of government or tent government under the shoguns. And then the biggest thing to remember here that's important is that the Edo period is going to lead to the closed country edicts. So once Tokugawa takes control of the country, he is really worried with all these Europeans who are coming in. So remember, this is when we're going to have like all the Catholics who are going to be basically burned at the stake. Well, they're crucified is what happens. There were a lot of these Catholics who were there trying to convert Japanese, and so those who did not recant ended up being crucified. As part of that crucifixion, then Christianity will be banned from the country, right? As will things like military technology, etc. The only place that the Tokugawa allowed European trade was going to be at this one city of Nagasaki on like this literal like fake little island that they built. They built this like one space where they could go to and nothing else. And because mostly the people that came there were Dutch, they called it Dutch studies because they would like study a bit about the Europeans and stuff that are outside that country. But obviously that causes a lot of problems. They are way behind technologically over time. And again, part of the reason that they do this is because they are worried about social disruption. They've just come out of this over 100-year-long civil war where everything went nuts. They're looking for peace and stability. So Tokugawa does this closed country because he doesn't want all this new ideology coming in. Christians who are trying to upset the social order, or guns that could upset the social order. So let's not have any of that kind of stuff take place. So that's why that's there. So fast forward then up until the 1850s, 60s. This is when the Americans come in. So this is going to be under Commodore Matthew Perry. He'll be instructed to open Japan. The reason for this is that the Americans are kind of shut out of China trade. So they were looking for someplace else to trade in Asia. And so they take a look at Japan. They're like, those people ain't trading. Let's make them trade. So this is where we send in our ships into Edo Bay, and we basically threaten them to get them to trade with us and open it up. And when they do that, then all the people in the Meiji government, like a lot of the kind of lower level or mid-level kind of people, are like, we are so far behind. So what happens then is that they rise up essentially, and they kick out the Tokugawa system in 1867. So they end that shogunate system that they used to have, and instead they will move over into a weird kind of oligarchy situation instead. Again, this is basically ruled by the powerful. So they do have like a parliament and stuff, but that parliament is primarily for those who are rich and powerful, not for like everyday people or anything like that. And so Meiji will be alive until 1912 when he will die. There's another emperor in between, but he's not important. And then we have the Showa Emperor in 1926. And the process of this then, from 1867 until 1905, which is pretty astonishing. That's what, 38 years? The Meiji basically Japanese basically go from like swords to major guns and stuff and blowing people up. So it's pretty impressive how quickly they're able to change their country. Going on then, of course, we end up with World War II. That will be ended, very importantly, by the nuclear weapons that are dropped. And then again, modern-day Japan is a fairly demilitarized country. They do have like a self-defense force, but it's not like designed to fight overseas. But it's fairly demilitarized today, and it's focused instead on like high-tech and its economy and stuff like that instead. Okay. Don't think I have much else to say about Korea, really. Again, just make sure you understand sort of like some of the differences between these and some of the similarities. So again, like similarities is that Buddhism is important in all these places, right? But a difference is sort of how it's received and how widespread it is. Similarities would be centralized governments, right? But the differences would be the nature of those centralized governments. Those would all be examples of things that you might be able to compare and contrast over time. Okay? All right. Well, that's what I have for me, as far as me just blathering away. What questions or things would you want to talk about? And this can be outside of our topic here as well, if you want to. So whatever you want. Yeah.
So Great Leap Forward, that was when they were becoming more industrialized.
Yeah, so in China then what happens is that so Mao Zedong had this like philosophy of communism. Okay, original communism says that that communism is going to come to an industrialized country, right? So like if you have a big industry like in France or Britain, the labor movement there will have a big awakening, and then they will rise up against their capitalist oppressors, right? The problem though is that like China doesn't have any industrial factor. Like they're all like, it's a peasant-based agriculture system. That's all they got there, right? So the problem for his philosophy is that like Marxism literally does not work in China. So Mao has a new idea, which is this idea of peasant power, that instead of having all of these little groups and stuff that are like industrial based, he's going to use peasants instead. So his philosophy here then for the Great Leap Forward is we're going to use all the mass line of peasants to create a new world. So we're going to have them creating this steel in their backyards. We're going to have them, producing all of this new stuff to make things better. But the problem, of course, is that it doesn't work. Like those things are bad ideas. So it is a failure, basically. The funniest thing to me about this is that after the Great Leap Forward fails, Mao Zedong steps up. I can't remember if it's called the 100 Flowers of Thought or something. There was a previous movement that was also called that, but let's just call it that. Basically, he steps forward and he says, "Everyone, listen. What new ideas do you have for us? What's going on? Like essentially, kind of being like, I failed a bit. So, what kind of new ideas maybe do you have, right?" And, well, no, even worse. When they come up with these new ideas, he has them all arrested. Yeah, he's like, "Oh, you think I'm wrong then, huh? Okay, cool." And then he arrests a bunch of those people, and during the Cultural Revolution, in an attempt to basically like clamp down on people who are criticizing him and stuff. So it's kind of a hilarious bait and switch. I like the idea though that you were so like kind about it, that you were like, "Oh, he wanted to take their ideas." Like, no, he doesn't want to do them at all. So good stuff. What other questions we got?
I'm good.
You good?
I think I'm good.
All right. Well, thanks for listening, folks. If you all have any questions, make sure to let me know. I'll be posting this. Well, you would have already seen it because I would have posted it already, but whatever. You get the point. Y'all take care. Hopefully this was helpful.